Long before the first Viking longship cut across the grey seas, before the first raider set foot on foreign shores, the Norse world was already alive with omens and whispers. Among these, two figures always lingered in the shadows of their myths, the raven and the wolf. To the people of the North, they were not just animals. They were living messengers, companions of gods, and in some tales, shapeshifters that bridged the realms of the living and the divine. Ravens were seen as keepers of thought and memory. The most famous were Hugin and Munin, the two black-feathered companions of Odin, the All-Father. Every dawn, they would take to the skies, soaring over Midgard, Jotunheim, and even the edges of hell, bringing back whispers of war, betrayal, harvest, and hope. At dusk, they returned to perch upon Odin's shoulders, croaking secrets into his one good ear, the ear that still listened after he had sacrificed the other for wisdom. Wolves, on the other hand, embodied hunger, ferocity, and untamed loyalty. At Odin's feet prowled Geri and Freki, two massive wolves fed by the meat of his feasts, while he himself consumed only wine. Their names, meaning the ravenous and the greedy, were no accident. They were the jaws of fate, devourers of battlefields, and the silent shadow beside every warrior. To the Vikings, these creatures were not distant myth. They were daily presences. A raven circling above a harbor could signal a raid success, or foretell disaster at sea. A lone wolf howl in the midnight snow could be an omen of war or a warning of betrayal. Killing such animals without cause was considered foolish, even dangerous, for they were said to be watched over by the gods themselves. As Viking longships began their legendary voyages, raiding coasts, trading silver, and founding new settlements, the images of ravens and wolves traveled with them. Raven banners were raised high upon masts, black wings painted on shields, and wolf pelts worn into battle by the fearsome Ulfhednar, wolf warriors who fought in a state of holy frenzy, biting their shields, howling as though possessed. The presence of these animals was not only spiritual but also practical. Ravens could locate carrion and guide sailors toward land. Wolves, though feared, were respected for their ability to hunt, scavenge, and survive in the most brutal of winters. To the Norse, a creature that could thrive when the world froze was a creature worth watching, and perhaps worth following. And so the mythic bond between man, raven, and wolf began not in battle, but in the quiet spaces between, in long winters, on silent coasts, by campfires under auroras. They were companions of gods, yes, but also companions of mortals, whispering that survival belonged to those who could remember, those who could think, and those who could hunger. The open sea was both the Vikings' greatest ally and their deadliest enemy. To master it meant wealth, glory, and conquest. To misread its moods meant cold death beneath grey waves. Long before compasses and sextants, the Norse relied on the sunstone, the stars, and, more strangely, on the flight of ravens. Ravens were not just sacred to Odin. They were practical tools for survival. In the sagas, there are tales of sailors releasing ravens from their ships to find land. If the bird circled and returned, there was nothing ahead but empty ocean. But if it flew straight and did not return, the men would follow, knowing its sharp eyes had spotted a distant shore or drifting ice. One of the most famous stories of raven navigation comes from Floki Vilgerdarsson, the man credited with discovering Iceland. According to the Landnámabók, Floki brought 3 ravens with him on his voyage. The first flew back to the Faroe Islands. The second returned to the ship, finding nothing but endless ocean. But the third, the one that flew forward and never came back, guided Floki to the smoky shores of Iceland, a land of fire and frost. Ravens were favored because they were intelligent, loyal if raised from chicks, and keen-eyed. Sailors would sometimes carry them in wooden cages, feeding them scraps of dried fish or pork fat during the journey. To a modern eye, it may seem strange, releasing a bird to find land. But for the Norse, this was not just seafaring lore. It was a sacred ritual, a moment of trust between man, God, and beast. The raven's role at sea went beyond navigation. Warriors believed that the birds carried the souls of the fallen to Valhalla, circling above battlefields, and later following the blood-scented winds back across the waves. Seeing ravens before a voyage was a good omen. It meant Odin was watching, and perhaps his hall would welcome those who died far from home. Sometimes raven banners were more than decoration. They were thought to summon the favor of Odin himself. The legendary raven banner was said to grant victory while it flew, but doom to the one who carried it when it fell. Kings such as Harald Hardrada and the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok marched beneath such banners, trusting in the black wings painted on silk more than in any sword. And yet the raven was never just a tool or a trophy. It was a living link between the wild and the divine. At sea, when fog swallowed the horizon and the stars hid their faces, a single dark shape rising into the sky could mean the difference between a new homeland and a watery grave. In the frozen forests and endless tundras of the north, wolves were not strangers, they were neighbors. To the Vikings, the wolf was both a threat and a teacher, a predator to be feared and a spirit to be honored. Its glowing eyes in the night reminded them that the wild was always watching, waiting for the weak to falter. In Norse mythology, wolves were among the most feared and revered creatures. The two most famous were Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to devour Odin at Ragnarok, and his children, Skjöll and Hati, who chased the sun and moon across the sky. Their hunt would one day succeed, plunging the world into darkness before its rebirth. But not all wolves were foes of the gods. Some were their companions, their chosen hunters. As Odin kept Geri and Freki, the god Tyr was said to have been the only one brave enough to feed Fenrir before his binding. In this duality, wolves symbolized both chaos and kinship, the force that could destroy the world and the loyalty that could guard it. For Viking warriors, the wolf was more than a story. It was an ideal. The Ulfhednar, or wolfcoats, were a brotherhood of berserkers who wore wolf pelts and fought with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. They believed they could channel the wolf spirit, losing their human hesitation and fighting with unthinking hunger. To see Ulfhednar charge was to face the winter itself, merciless, silent, unstoppable. In daily life, wolves shaped the rhythms of the north. They followed herds, shadowed caravans, and sometimes even lingered at the edges of settlements, scavenging what they could. To farmers and herders, they were a danger to sheep and cattle, but to hunters, they were allies. Their paths leading to game trails and fresh kills, the wolf's howl was a sound of both terror and comfort. It warned travelers of approaching danger, yet also reminded them they were not alone in the frozen dark. Some Norse families even adopted wolf pups, raising them alongside their dogs to guard longhouses or accompany them on hunts. These tamed wolves blurred the line between wild and loyal, beast and kin. Wolves were also a part of ritual and prophecy. Skalds spoke of warriors guided by wolves in dreams, and of seers who claimed the shape of the wolf during trance journeys. To wear a wolf tooth as an amulet was to invite courage. To hear a wolf cry during a birth was to believe the child would grow strong and fierce. And so, the wolf in Viking culture was never only a beast to be hunted. It was the winter's shadow, the hunger that drove migration, the spirit that followed. Raiding parties and the silent watcher on distant hills. To live in the north was to share it with wolves, to learn from them, fear them, and sometimes become them. When the Northmen sailed to war, they did not march alone. Their gods sailed with them, their ancestors whispered in the wind, and their banners bore the black wings of ravens and the grey shadows of wolves. To their enemies, these symbols were more than mere decoration. They were warnings of what followed: slaughter, plunder, and the cold silence of the afterlife. Raven banners, known in the sagas as Hrafnsmerki, were said to bring victory to those who bore them. The sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Ubbe and Halfdan, carried such banners during the great heathen army's invasion of England in the 9th century. Chronicles spoke of their flags as living things. When the raven banner flapped proudly, victory was assured. When it hung lifeless, defeat was near. The raven was more than a sign of victory. It was a scavenger of war. These birds followed armies for the promise of corpses, picking at the dead long after the clash of steel had faded. To the Vikings, this was not a shameful thing. It was natural, even sacred. The raven cleansed the field, fed upon sacrifice, and carried the fallen's essence skyward. Wolves, too, haunted the edges of war. In the sagas, they are described as the night that follows battle, appearing silently when the last cries have ended. Packs would trail armies during winter raids, drawn by the smell of blood and smoke. This eerie partnership between man and predator created an image the enemies of the Norse would not forget. To be defeated by Vikings was to feed the wolves. And the ravens. Some Viking chieftains embraced this fear and used it as a weapon. They kept trained ravens in cages, releasing them before a battle to circle overhead, casting their shadows on the enemy lines. Others dressed their warriors in wolf and raven motifs, black feathered cloaks, snarling wolf helms, talismans carved from bone and claw. For the Ulfhednar and Berserkers, this was not just theatre, it was transformation. They believed that by wearing the skin of a wolf or invoking the spirit of the raven, they became more than men. They entered a trance called Berserk's Ganga, a storm of rage where wounds did not slow them and fear could not touch them. 2. The foe? They were not soldiers but beasts unleashed. The enemies of the Vikings often described their armies as the raven's feast or the wolf's winter. Monks wrote of flocks of ravens darkening the sky before raids, of wolves howling on the shore as ships approached. Whether these tales were truth or terror-touched exaggeration did not matter. They served the Vikings well. Fear fought alongside them, and so, in the wars of the North, wings and fangs were not just ornaments of myth. They were psychological, weapons, scavengers of flesh, heralds of the gods, and companions to men who believed that death was only the doorway to a greater hall. For most Vikings, life was not spent raiding foreign shores or marching beneath great banners. It was spent farming, trading, fishing, building, and surviving long winters that could swallow a man's strength whole. And yet, even in the quiet rhythms of the North, ravens and wolves were never far away. A raven perched upon a roof at dawn might bring news of a traveler or an unexpected guest. To some, it was a herald of prosperity. To others, a sign that death would soon visit the household. Women tending their looms would pause and whisper charms if they heard a raven call 3 times in a row, for that was said to mean a spirit had crossed the threshold of the unseen. Wolves, meanwhile, haunted the edges of fields and forests. Farmers built high fences not just for cattle thieves, but for the grey shadows that slipped through snowdrifts at night. A missing sheep in winter was not blamed on mischief. It was the work of Skjöld's kin, the wolf who chased the sun. Yet these same wolves were often respected, even fed with scraps thrown far from the hearth in hopes they would hunt elsewhere. Children grew up with tales of ravens that carried messages to the gods and wolves that walked beside lost travelers to guide them home or devour them. Grandmothers tied raven feathers above cradles to protect infants from wandering spirits. Hunters wore wolf claws on leather cords around their necks to grant sharp senses and luck in the chase. In Norse magic, cider, both creatures played important roles. Seeresses called Valur were said to summon the shapes of ravens during trance, their croaks echoing as omens for kings. Wolves appeared in dream walks and in the smoke of burnt offerings, carrying questions across the veil to distant ancestors. Ravens were also practical allies in daily life. Fishermen tossed them off cliffs to gauge the wind's direction. Hunters watched them to find herds or carcasses. Wolves, though more dangerous, were mirrors of survival. How they tracked, how they endured, how they fed their young in the bleakest of months. To observe them was to learn how to live in a land that forgave little. Some families even raised ravens as household companions, teaching them to mimic words, to steal trinkets from neighbors, or to warn of approaching strangers. A tame raven was considered a sign of wit and status, a creature of the gods brought to heal. Wolves were rarer as companions, but not unheard of. Sagas mention warriors traveling with half-wild wolves on leashes, more symbol than pet. And thus, in the quiet hum of the north, where the sea ice cracked and the long nights stretched forever, these creatures were not distant myths. They were part of the same cold breath, the same starlit silence. Ravens and wolves were as much a part of the Viking world as the hammer of Thor or the sails of their ships. Always watching, always waiting, always whispering. To live as a Viking was to live with death as a constant companion. Winter could take a man as swiftly as a sword, and the sea claim more lives than 100 kings. Yet in the Norse mind, death was not an end. It was a crossing. And on that crossing, two creatures often walked beside the soul, the raven and the wolf. Ravens were known as Valravner in some tales, corpse ravens, said to appear where blood was spilled. They were thought to carry the souls of the fallen to Odin's hall, Valhalla, or to Freya's field, Folkvanger, depending on who claimed the warrior's spirit. To see a flock descend upon a battlefield was not horror to a Viking. It was confirmation that the gates of the afterlife were open. Wolves, too, had their place among the dead. They were the scavengers of the twilight world, the harbingers of Ragnarok. Fenrir, the wolf of prophecy, was chained by the gods because his jaws were destined to swallow Odin himself at the end of all things. His sons, Skuld and Hati, would one day devour the sun and moon, plunging the world into darkness before it was reborn. Yet not all wolves were bringers of doom. Many were guides, spirits that led fallen warriors along the Helvega, the road to the realm of the dead. In some sagas, the dying claimed to see a black wolf waiting at the foot of their bed, not to devour them, but to lead them where their kin awaited. To die with a wolf at your side was to be remembered as fierce. Ravens also played a role in funerary rites. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia reveal raven feathers among burial goods, laid beside swords, shields, and boats. Some scholars believe these feathers symbolize the journey of the soul, the bird that would fly where the body could not. Others say they were offerings to Odin, a reminder that the warrior's thoughts and memories now belonged to him. Wolves, in turn, guarded the edges of hell, the realm of the dead who did not fall in battle. The Gylfaginning speaks of Garma, the great hound chained before hell's gates, whose howls would signal the end of days. For common folk, wolves were not only predators of flesh, but wardens of that silent shore, keeping restless spirits from wandering. The presence of ravens at executions, at plagues, at pyres, etched them into the Viking mind as the eyes of fate. To see them gather was to know that the Norns, the weavers of destiny, had already cut the thread. And when wolves howled in the long night, mothers would whisper, "They count the souls that will not see the dawn." But even in death, these creatures were not seen as evil. They were necessary. Just as winter clears the earth for spring, so too did the raven and the wolf clear the world of the fallen, carrying their essence to where it belonged, whether in the halls of glory, the quiet fields of Freya, or the cold roads of hell. When we picture the Viking world, we often imagine roaring longships and clashing axes, but the Vikings also spoke through symbols. Their jewelry, their carvings, their banners and their runes carried meanings deeper than words. Among those markings, two shapes appeared again and again, the curved wings of the raven and the sharp fangs of the wolf. On brooches found in Birka, Hedeby and Gotland, ravens were etched with wings outstretched, often in pairs facing each other across a warrior's chest. These were not merely decorations. They invoked Hugin and Munin, Odin's thought and memory, so that the wearer might gain insight in battle or on the road. Wolves appeared in torque necklaces, carved with bared teeth, or as mask-like pendants worn by the Ulfhednar, wolf warriors who sought to channel the beast's fury. Archaeological finds reveal wolf skulls placed in graves beside spears, their presence meant to grant the dead strength in the afterlife. Runestones, too, carried their shadows. The famous Ramsund carving in Sweden depicts the hero Sigurd slaying the dragon Fafnir, with birds whispering secrets to him, ravens that foretold betrayal and victory alike. Elsewhere, stylized wolves flank runic inscriptions, guarding the names of the dead or calling vengeance upon enemies. Raven banners, Hrafnsmerki, were among the most feared symbols at sea. Woven from black silk or dyed wool, they fluttered on the masts of kings like Harald Hardrada and Sigurd the Stout. It was said that when the banner flapped in the wind, victory would come. When it hung limp, doom was near. Wolves marked the wild path of the berserkers. Those who wore wolf pelts in war claimed to fight without fear or mercy, their howls rising over the clash of shields. To wear a wolfskin was to declare yourself untamed, a man of the edges, neither wholly human nor beast. Even in domestic life, these images crept into woodwork and weaving, carved chair legs shaped like raven talons, doorposts ending in snarling wolf heads, tapestries where dark birds wheeled over ships. For a culture that valued both memory and might, these creatures were reminders. Wisdom can see far, and strength can strike fast. To wear the raven or the wolf was to carry a prayer without speaking it, for cunning, for ferocity, for the favor of gods who were never silent but often unseen. And as traders and raiders carried their crafts abroad, these symbols spread to the British Isles, to the Rus, to the edges of the Frankish kingdoms, where frightened monks sketched them in the margins of their chronicles. By the time the Viking age waned, ravens and wolves had become more than mythic echoes. They were marks of identity, carried by men and women alike, telling the world, I belong to the North, to its cold, to its silence, to its fury. As the Viking age drew to a close, the longships came to rest, the raids faded, and the old gods began to fall silent. But the ravens and wolves remained, not just in the forests and fjords, but in the stories, the carvings, the sagas that outlived their makers. With the spread of Christianity, many ancient symbols were cast as dark or demonic. Wolves became, in the eyes of priests, the fangs of the devil, while ravens were called carrion birds of ill omen. Crosses replaced rune stones. Churches rose where once stood sacred groves. Yet even then, the Norse could not wholly abandon their shadows. In Icelandic law codes of the 11th century, it is said that outlawed men, Fjarðarsgarda, were compared to wolves, driven from society to live as beasts. To be called Wolf's Head was to be marked for death, and yet in secret songs and in lonely farms, people still whispered the names of Fenrir and Garma. Ravens fared better. They became companions of saints in some northern tales, messengers that foretold weather to fishermen, symbols adopted into coats of arms by noble families, tracing shadowed bloodlines. The two ravens of Odin were remembered in poetry long after his name faded from prayer. In the modern age, archaeologists have unearthed their bones, their feathers, their stories. Wolves return to the forests of Scandinavia after centuries of absence. Ravens gather on city rooftops, where once they wheeled over longships. The world changes, but the watchers remain. And what do they mean now? To some, they are echoes of a brutal age. To others they are guardians of memory, teachers of cunning, strength and survival. The raven still teaches us to look beyond what is seen. The wolf still teaches us that freedom often walks with hunger. In the end, the legacy of ravens and wolves is not only theirs, it is ours. They were never gods. They were guides, reflections of the wildness in men's hearts, the darkness that made courage possible. The Vikings did not tame them, they learned from them, and perhaps that is why, 1,000 years later, we still speak their names.